Before I begin this commentary, I like to address the Michael Franzese stands that are listening or watching. Now, I understand in your eyes, Michael can do no wrong, and you probably won't agree with what I'm about to say. I welcome all opposing views, but my only caveat is that you're respectful. Any comment that's out of line or out of pocket in my comment section, I'm removing immediately, and you'll likely get blocked depending on my mood. So tread lightly, and you only get one strike on this channel. Now let's get into today's presentation. Recently, I watched Michael Franzese discussing Bumpy Johnson and Dutch Schultz on Vlad TV, and it's quite clear he doesn't know that aspect of mob history, and I don't understand why DJ Vlad always has to ask him that. I mean, it's quite clear this is something that he's not knowledgeable about, and he's just only giving his limited information about them. So, anyway, from what I watched, Michael just knew Bumpy as a drug dealer. And yeah, Bumpy was a drug dealer. There's no running from that. He was involved in the drug trade, but he also dealt with numbers and to an extent pimping. In fact, Bumpy and Dutch, when they were at war, it was over the lucrative numbers trade as depicted in the classic 1997 movie Hoodlum, which also was written by Chris Brancanto. He wrote the screenplay for Hoodlum and directed, of course, by the great Bill Duke, who some of us know from that iconic scene in Menace to Society where he said, "You know you done fucked up, right?" But anyway, they were fighting over the numbers racket in Harlem. And since some of Bumpy's and since Bumpy and some of the other banks fought for independence of their business in Harlem, they were allowed independence, providing that they kicked up a small percentage to the Italians. Now, Bumpy negotiated a deal with Lucky Luciano after the demise of Dutch Schultz, because for some of you who know your mob history, the Italians decided to take Dutch Schultz out when Dutch was planning on eliminating Thomas Dewey. So that was why he was taken out. Lucky would later be Bumpy's plug in the drug game until he was deported. So this debunks Michael's point about the mob not being involved in drugs. Now, to be fair to Michael, Michael said that, there was, they weren't supposed to be in drugs, but there were some people that participated in it anyway, even though that there were consequences for doing so. But this must have been right around when Michael got into the mob, not when Bumpy Johnson was on the streets and Lucky Luciano was there, because Lucky Luciano, he was the boss, and he was also the founder of Costa Nostra. And a little bit of side note, Lucky and Bumpy, they were friends. They had a friendship because Bumpy saved Lucky from getting stabbed in prison. I forgot what prison that they were in. And Lucky would occasionally meet up with Bumpy in Harlem or at the Y or something, and they would play chess. So that is their relationship. So their relationship wasn't just a business one. They were friends as well. But I do notice that this really isn't talked about. And I know it's not talked about because more than likely Michael doesn't know this and he didn't bother to research or study it. And I watched his other video his review he did on The Godfather of Harlem, and it's quite clear he didn't do his homework on Bumpy Johnson. Now, regarding The Godfather of Harlem, I do agree with Michael that it's fictional, but in all fairness to the producers of The Godfather of Harlem, they put a disclaimer before the actual show begins so people know it's fictional. The show itself would pretty much fit into the category of historical fiction. But I will say that some of what's depicted in The Godfather of Harlem is inspired by some truth or urban legends. Now, Bumpy didn't war with the Italians, but upon the deportation of Lucky Luciano and everything, he was dealing with newer people that replaced Lucky, and they weren't as cordial with Bumpy and everything, and that would lead to somewhat of conflict, but it didn't escalate into a full blown war on the streets. In fact, with some of them mobsters and all that, they pretty much avoided war at all costs because when you go into a war, you lose money. You know, no one wants to go to war. So most conflicts were either settled at a table or was settled by a phone call. And there was one instance where where Bumpy had a bit of a disagreement with Fat Tony, who was the acting boss of the Genovese family when Bumpy got out, because Bumpy was getting a cut of their action in Harlem and whatnot. And when Bumpy got out, those Italians were reluctant to continue honoring the deal that he had with Lucky. So Fat Tony, he called Lucky on the phone, was like, yo, Bumpy is wanting this and that. And Lucky's response was, he's Bumpy. Bumpy's my boy. Give him what he wants. Click. And they couldn't argue with Lucky. So despite the fact that Lucky was in Italy, they still had to follow Lucky's orders. So they so they continued that business as usual with Bumpy. And that was pretty much the extent of that conflict. But according to Mamie in The Harlem Godfather, the book that she wrote, yeah, there was a little bit of tension with, certain Italian mobsters. And you know something, there's plenty more I can get into with this, but I recommend you picking up a copy of Harlem Godfather by Mamie Johnson and Karen E. Quinones Miller, because that book expounds on the history of Bumpy Johnson, but not just Bumpy Johnson, but Harlem itself. And it's told through the perspective of Bumpy Johnson's wife, Mamie Johnson. And I would say, as far as Godfather of Harlem, the actress playing Mamie, she's exactly how I would picture Mamie being in her heyday. And she was exactly a ride or die companion for Bumpy. And Bumpy did do a lot of confiding in her in regards to his activities and such. So that part of Godfather of Harlem is real as far as that goes. But if you really want to know more about Bumpy Johnson, I suggest you pick up a copy of Harlem Godfather. It's available on Amazon. I had to get another copy because I lost my original copy when I moved. So get you a copy of Harlem Godfather on Amazon. So, audience, tell me what you think. Let me know in the comment box, and please keep it respectful. This is Iron Will Media. Oh, yeah, one more thing before I end this commentary. Chris Bercanto also is the writer, showrunner of The Godfather of Harlem. He originally didn't want to be a part of The Godfather of Harlem, but he was talked into it once he saw what angle they were going for, what the premise was going to be. So he had the distinction of writing Bumpy not once, but twice. So this is Iron Will Media.